Okay, let us resume with part two of this presentation. Let me scroll down to it now. Europe is presently being intimidated slowly into a state of dimitude. See Eurabia, the Euro-Arab axis, and her Europe globalization and the coming universal caliphate. It is being intimidated by terrorist acts, by political pressure, and by the leveraging of oil. This is why, by the way, we need to convert to an economy based on energy independence. The dimitude being forced on Europe is more insidious than an explicit ultimatum, unlike the medieval period, for example. To really appreciate the relentless pressure on European leaders and the gradual loss of freedom in Europe, these two works by Bat-Yeor are indispensable. Since civilization jihad in the United States is not as far along as in Europe, it is very instructive to read her works to prepare for what is coming in the U.S. The civilization jihad imposed on Europe includes allowing Muslim immigrants to refuse to be assimilated and for Europe to be continually forced to make accommodations to Muslims and concessions to Islam. As an example, in the UK, Muslims may settle their legal disputes in Sharia courts and are not bound to go to ordinary civil courts. One may ask, what leverage do Islamic actors like the Organization of Islamic Conference have on Europe? These are some of the sources of leverage. Europe's need of access to oil is one. Germany's guilt over the Jewish Holocaust is another. Also, Islamic actors are appealing to Europe's commitment to multiculturalism to force it to open the floodgates of immigration, resulting in the decimation of its own cultural and national identities. Another tactic used by Islamic actors is to create many transnational dialogue groups or study groups to which member states of the European Union send delegates. These dialogue groups arrive at policy statements which advance Islam's agenda for creating Eurabia, which to a naive observer appear to be bland policy statements. But to one with historical and political background, they have the cumulative effect of stealing away the national sovereignty of member states of the European Union. At some point, the common citizens of the member states begin to see the effect of these decisions and wonder why they were not consulted. What they do not realize is that these consultative groups have essentially stolen away the national sovereignty of the member states and denied the citizenry of the democratic participation in deciding their own fate. This method of civilization jihad is resulting in the political suicide of Europe. Another element of this technique is the continuous pressure put on member states to demonize and politically isolate Israel. All of these tactics are broken out in detail by Bat-Yeor in her Eurabia, the Euro-Arab axis. This technique is being used on a smaller scale by Muslim Brotherhood front groups to implement policies in American society under the noses of or over the objections of citizens of the United States. Civilization jihad also expresses itself in intimidating political and academic institutions and agents to not confront the sordid past of Islam, to not question Islam's theology, or to face its present intentions. Then to further tie the truth's hands, in Islamic law, slander and libel consists of saying things that are merely offensive to Muslims. It is not the same as Western laws in which slander and libel involve saying something malicious which is untrue. Even if the statements are made are the truth, in Islamic law, if they offend Muslims, they are illegal. The Islamic law of slander is an affront to free speech and free inquiry. It is a prescription for tyranny. Islamic actors seek to establish centers for Islamic studies in universities throughout Europe and the United States in an effort to disseminate Islamic propaganda, to promote Arabic as a lingua franca, and to promote revisionism, to wit that European culture and science emanated from and depend on Arabic culture. Civilization jihad also expresses itself in a historical revisionism, to wit that Islam is actually temporally and theologically prior to Christianity and Judaism, that Christianity and Judaism are distortions of the one true Abrahamic faith, namely Islam. These centers for Islamic studies are typically funded by Saudi Arabia using petrodollars. This means that every dollar you spend to fuel your gas-powered car is helping to fund the Islamization of your country. Think about that. This is what civilization jihad looks like. Bet yours works document this propaganda war in great detail. It is a matter of time before the U.S. will fall prey to dimitude like Europe has if it does not take positive steps to prevent it. Historically, dimitude was a formal contract presented to people of the book. If they were willing to pay the jizya in the 20th and 21st centuries in Europe, but in the 20th and 21st century in Europe, dimitude presents itself as the intimidation of Europe into adopting policies against its interests, and as a prelude to corroding and eventually annihilating the national identity of member states. The attempt to combat terrorism by mere counterterrorism is just attacking the symptom, not the root cause. The fuel of terrorism is jihad, and the fuel of jihad is just Islamic theology. The fact that the root problem stems from Islamic theology puts the addressing of the problem beyond the reach of governments. Governments are not supposed to attack religions, but Islam is not merely a religion. It is a totalizing worldview, which includes a political component and a religious component. Islam expresses itself to the world as a political movement, a this worldly armed actor. That is, it is a religion that sanctions violence to propagate itself. The passages I gave above are only some of the passages in Islamic canonical literature which express the imperialistic and violent character of Islam. A so-called religion which gives itself permission to engage in territorial conquest is not a mere religion. It is a political actor. Either it is a political state or a political movement. Let me express this thought in a few more ways to make myself clear. Islam is a violent political ideology driven by a set of religious doctrines. Or Islam is a political ideology whose violent expansionism is driven by its theology. Furthermore, Islam is totalitarian, like communism was totalitarian. There is no freedom of thought, much less liberal democracy under the Islamic system. If you doubt me, I invite you to read Reliance of the Traveler, a classic manual of Islamic sacred law. It is meaningless to ask why it is that people are willing to live under such oppression. Nobody chooses to live under tyranny. In Islamic thought, the notion of freedom is inverted. Islam teaches that the Western concept of freedom is illusory. Perfect freedom in Islamic thought is just submission, which is the meaning of Islam. A Muslim is free because he is submitted to Islam. In Islamic thought, it is impossible to be free if you are living under a human government. You are, in that case, in slavery to other men. So, whereas in the West, freedom is thought to be from our entering into a contract with others when we form a government, in Islamic thought, this is thought to always lead to slavery. In Islamic theology, the discipline of secular jurisprudence is entirely illegitimate. In Islamic thought, jurisprudence is just the creating of man-made law. In Islamic thought, this is just to make men in servitude to other men, since laws are man-made. The only way to free men from man-made law is to eliminate all man-made laws and base all law on the Quran, the Sunnah, or inferences by Islamic scholars. This is what is meant by Sharia law. Reliance of the Traveler, a classic manual of Islamic sacred law, is a good first place to get a handle on Sharia. It purports to faithfully summarize and organize canonical texts. It carries the imprimatur of authoritative Islamic bodies. The following set of quotations are taken from Sayyid Qutb, died 1966. in his book Milestones, chapter 4, entitled Jihad in the Cause of God. I will add numbered comments, and then at the end I'll summarize what I think is foundational Islamic political theory. Okay, first quote. Whenever Islam stood up with the universal declaration that God's lordship should be established over the entire earth and that men should become free from servitude to other men, the usurpers of God's authority on earth have struck out fiercely against it and have never tolerated it. It became incumbent upon Islam to strike back and release man throughout the earth from the grip of these usurpers. The eternal struggle for the freedom of man will continue until the religion is purified for God. Okay, so my responses are: number one, Qutb here assumes that all earthly governments are usurpers of Allah's authority. Two, the expression of Allah's authority on earth is to be manifest through political domination. Three, jihad is that expression of Islam striking back at the usurpers of God's authority on earth. From the standpoint of a Muslim, the struggle of jihad is the struggle against the tyranny of human governments. 4. The purpose of jihad is to release man from all man-made authority. But this assumes that Islam is not just another man-made authority. If Islam's claims to be revelation are false, Islam just becomes a monstrous tyranny. Then Qutb says, the way to establish God's rule on earth is not that some consecrated people, the priests, be given authority to rule, as was the case with the rule of the church, nor that some spokesmen of God became rulers, as is the case with a theocracy. To establish God's rule means that his laws be enforced and that the final decision in all affairs be according to these laws. The establishing of the dominion of God on earth, the abolishing of the dominion of man, the taking away the sovereignty from the usurper and revert it to God, and the bringing about of the enforcement of the divine law, Sharia, and the abolition of man-made laws cannot be achieved only through preaching. Those who have usurped the authority of God or are oppressing God's creatures are not going to give up their power merely through preaching. If it had been so, the task of establishing God's religion in the world would have been very easy for the prophets of God. This is contrary to the evidence from the history of the prophets and the story of the struggle of the true religion spread over generations. This universal declaration of the freedom of man on earth from every authority except that of God, and the declaration of that sovereignty is God's alone, and the declaration that sovereignty is God's alone, and that he is the Lord of the universe, is not merely a theoretical, philosophical, or passive proclamation. It is a positive, practical, and dynamic message with a view to bringing people from their servitude to other men to bring them into the service of God, the one without associates. This cannot be attained unless both preaching and the movement are used. This is so because appropriate means are needed to bring to meet any and every practical situation. Anyone who understands this particular character of this religion will also understand the place of jihad bi-sayf, striving through fighting, which is to clear the way for striving through preaching in the application of the Islamic movement. It was a movement to wipe out tyranny and to introduce true freedom to mankind. Okay, number 5, Qutb accuses Judaism and Christianity of mediating political authority through a priesthood, and that this is theocracy. If theocracy is mediated by priests, then, he says, Islam isn't a theocracy. This is because Sharia law does not need to be mediated by a priesthood because it is coming directly through Allah. Okay, let me pause here and we'll go on to the next section.